Imagine walking into a cafe, hungry and tired, only to be met with cold stares and harsh words. Now imagine that this isn't just about hunger, but about a deeper, heartbreaking story of lost love, resilience, and unexpected redemption. How could a simple sandwich lead to uncovering a long-lost connection that would heal not just one but 3 broken hearts? Stay with us as we unravel this powerful tale of kindness, forgiveness, and the bond that time could not erase. If you love stories that touch your heart and inspire your soul, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. The sun was barely breaking through the cloudy skies, casting a dull light over the sleepy town. A gentle drizzle had just stopped, leaving the air crisp and cold. Inside a busy cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the chatter of morning patrons, each absorbed in their conversations. It was a typical day marked by nothing more than the clinking of cups and low hum of conversation. Then the door swung open with a creak. All eyes briefly turned toward the figure standing in the doorway. James, a frail 89-year-old man, paused for a moment, blinking against the change in light. His steps were slow, almost dragging, as he made his way inside. His clothes were old and worn, the fabric faded and patched in several places. His shoes, barely holding together, revealed the tips of his toes. He clutched his coat tightly around his thin frame, trying to shield himself from the biting cold that had settled into his bones. James moved forward, his trembling hands gripping the edge of a nearby table for support. He ignored the curious looks from the other patrons, who exchanged whispers that seemed to follow him like shadows. To James, the whispers felt like judgments. He kept his eyes lowered, avoiding direct contact, but the weight of their stares pressed heavily upon him. Each step was a struggle between dignity and necessity. Reaching the counter, James placed a few crumpled dollar bills and loose change on the surface. His hands shook as he tried to organize the coins, his fingers rough and dirty from years of hardship. Behind the counter stood the Margaret, a stern woman in her 50s. Her white apron was stained with old coffee spills, and her expression was as harsh as her tone. She glanced down at James with a mix of disdain and impatience. "What do you want?" she asked brusquely, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the disheveled man before her. James swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a sandwich, the cheapest one you have, please." Margaret folded her arms, her gaze colder than the wind outside. "This isn't a homeless shelter, old man," she snapped. "If you don't have enough money, you can't eat here." A wave of humiliation washed over James, but he tried to maintain his composure. His stomach growled audibly, betraying his hunger. Desperate, he managed to plead softly, "Please, anything you can spare. I'm hungry." The words seemed to bounce off Margaret like rubber against stone. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think you can just come in here and ask for free food? We don't have leftovers for beggars. Go somewhere else." The murmurs among the customers grew louder, some of them laughing quietly while others simply shook their heads. One man seated near the counter muttered, "Yeah, get out of here, old man. We don't need the likes of you here." James felt tears stinging his eyes, but he didn't allow them to fall. He was frozen, unsure whether to leave or to continue pleading. At that moment, the cafe door opened once more. This time, a gust of cold air followed the entrance of Isabel, a well-dressed woman in her early 40s. Her brown hair was perfectly styled, and her sharp business suit radiated confidence. As she stepped inside, her eyes immediately landed on the scene at the counter. She noticed James's hunched figure, the trembling hands clutching the last of his money, and Margaret's unyielding posture. Isabel's eyes flashed with disapproval as she approached the counter with purposeful strides. Her presence commanded attention, and the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. Even Margaret, momentarily caught off guard, faltered in her harsh stance. "What's going on here?" Isabel asked, her voice firm yet calm. She turned to Margaret, her expression expectant. Margaret attempted to maintain her authoritative demeanor. "This man can't pay for his food," she said flatly. "We don't serve charity here." Isabel glanced at James, who stood there with his head bowed, his frail shoulders slumped under the weight of shame. She felt a surge of empathy and something else, an urgency she couldn't quite explain. She turned back to Margaret, her voice unwavering. "I'll pay for his meal." The cafe fell silent, the murmurs replaced by surprise. Margaret's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "That's not how we do things here," she insisted, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. Isabel leaned forward, her tone soft but steely. "You talk about charity as if it's a burden. But humanity isn't optional, Margaret. It's the very essence of business, and right now this man deserves to be treated like any other customer." James looked up slowly, his eyes meeting Isabel's. They were filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, and a small glimmer of hope appeared on his weathered face. He managed to whisper, "Thank you." Isabel nodded gently. "You're welcome," she replied, then turned to Margaret once more. "Please make him the best sandwich you have, and a hot cup of coffee, too." Margaret, though visibly reluctant, complied. As she prepared the order, Isabel remained by James's side. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The hostility that had filled the room dissipated, replaced by a sense of unease among the onlookers. Isabel offered James a warm smile, one that carried both kindness and reassurance. "Today, lunch is on me," she said, "and you're welcome here, just like anyone else." The atmosphere inside the cafe remained thick with a mix of embarrassment and discomfort. James, the frail elderly man, stood silently by the counter, his wrinkled hands still clutching the few crumpled dollar bills that were supposed to buy him a simple meal. The customers who had previously laughed or looked away now averted their eyes, unsure of how to respond to the scene unfolding before them. Isabel, meanwhile, maintained her confident posture, her presence commanding the room in a way that seemed almost out of place in the modest cafe. She was not just any customer. She was a figure well known in the town. A successful businesswoman, the owner of a luxury boutique chain that had elevated her status among the locals. With her perfectly tailored suit, polished brown hair, and air of authority, Isabel had an aura that turned heads wherever she went. But today it was not her status that mattered. It was her compassion. Margaret, the cafe owner, stood stiffly behind the counter, her face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. Isabel's intervention had caught her off guard, and the authoritative tone in Isabel's voice had left her feeling exposed. As Isabel continued to stare her down, Margaret tried to regain some semblance of control. "This isn't a place for charity," Margaret insisted, crossing her arms defensively. Her voice was steady, but there was a slight tremble that betrayed her discomfort. "If he can't pay, he can't eat. That's just business." Isabel tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with a mix of incredulity and disappointment. "Business, Margaret?" she repeated, her tone now tinged with irony. "Businesses are made of people, and right now you seem to have forgotten that." Margaret's cheeks reddened further as the patrons listened in awkward silence, unsure whether to side with the owner or the elegant woman who had unexpectedly become James's advocate. It wasn't often that someone openly challenged Margaret, and it certainly wasn't common for someone like Isabel to step into such a situation. Isabel turned her attention back to James, who stood with his head bowed, seemingly torn between gratitude and lingering shame. His trembling fingers continued to hold the few coins he had collected, a testament to his desperation. Isabel's eyes softened, and she offered him a warm, reassuring smile. "Don't worry," she said gently, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "Today's lunch is on me, Mr. James," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the lingering hush in the cafe. "My name is James." "Well, James," Isabel continued, "you're going to have a proper meal today. It's the least we can do for each other in this world." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that seemed to cut through the tension in the room. James's eyes, filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief, met Isabel's. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself a small smile. His voice, shaky with emotion, managed a soft, "Thank you." Margaret, still visibly rattled by the confrontation, tried one last time to assert her authority. "I've been running this cafe for over 20 years, Isabel. I know how to keep it profitable. I can't afford to just give away food." Isabel's expression remained steady, but her eyes glinted with an intensity that Margaret couldn't ignore. "And I understand the need for profit, Margaret, but there's also a need for humanity. Sometimes it's not about the cost of a meal, but the value of kindness." The words seemed to linger in the air, echoing the silent thoughts of several customers who now seemed less interested in their coffee and more invested in the unfolding moral debate. Isabel's stance, both firm and compassionate, had shifted the tone of the entire room. Even the man who had initially mocked James appeared more contemplative, his smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. As Margaret hesitated, Isabel reached into her handbag and pulled out a crisp $50 bill, placing it deliberately on the counter. "This should more than cover James's meal today. And perhaps, Margaret, you could consider offering him a cup of coffee, too." The unexpected gesture left Margaret no room for further argument. She picked up the bill, avoiding eye contact with Isabel as she rang up the order. Isabel, satisfied that James would finally be served, turned her attention back to him. "Let's find you a seat," she said kindly, gesturing toward an empty table by the window. James, still overwhelmed by the turn of events, nodded gratefully. You didn't have to do this," he stammered as he shuffled over to the table. His voice was hoarse, heavy with a lifetime of hardship. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me, James," Isabel replied as she helped him settle into the chair. "Sometimes all we need is a reminder that kindness still exists." As James sank into the chair, the weight of the moment seemed to lift from his frail shoulders. He watched as Margaret, now subdued, placed a freshly made sandwich and a steaming cup of coffee on the table. She did so without a word, her earlier hostility replaced by a grudging sense of duty. Isabel remained standing by James's side, her gaze never wavering from him. "Eat," she encouraged, her tone softer now. "You deserve it." James's hand shook slightly as he reached for the sandwich, almost as if he feared that the meal might vanish before his eyes. He took a tentative bite, savoring the simple comfort of bread and filling. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment, the cafe's noise seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet gratitude of a man who had found unexpected kindness in an unlikely place. Isabel watched him with a mix of satisfaction and curiosity. There was something about James, something beyond the obvious struggles of old age and poverty, that intrigued her. As she stood there, observing the man before her, her gaze drifted back to the old watch on his wrist. The sight of it stirred a memory, faint yet persistent, from a past she had long tried to forget. "James," she began tentatively, "that watch of yours, it seems familiar." James paused, looking down at his wrist as if only now remembering the timepiece he wore. "Oh, it was a gift," he said, his voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "From someone very dear to me. My son." A flicker of emotion crossed Isabel's face, something between surprise and recognition, but she held back her questions, sensing that there was much more to James's story than he had shared. As she stood beside him, the first seeds of a deeper connection began to take root, and she knew that this encounter was only the beginning. The air in the cafe had settled into a strange, expectant silence. James, now seated comfortably at the table, continued to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a rare luxury. Isabel stood nearby, her eyes still lingering on the old watch wrapped around his wrist. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, its shape, the worn leather strap, and the small, delicate engraving on the back. It was the kind of watch that wasn't just functional but carried a story, a memory preserved in metal. "James," Isabel said again, this time her voice softer, tinged with curiosity. "Would you mind if I took a closer look at your watch?" James hesitated, his movements cautious as he unfastened the strap. He handed it over to Isabel with a mixture of pride and reluctance. "It's all I have left of him," he explained, his voice low but steady. "My son, Emmanuel, he gave it to me before he—" James's voice broke for a moment, but he quickly composed himself, his eyes downcast. "Before he passed." Isabel's heart clenched at the mention of Emmanuel. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the watch. Turning it over, she saw the familiar engraving on the back. to Emmanuel with love, Isabel." The name etched in delicate script sent a wave of emotion crashing through her. It was as if the past had reached out, breaking through time to confront her in this moment. The watch was indeed the same one she had given Emmanuel, the man she had loved more than anything. It was meant to be a symbol of their plans for a future that had never come to be. The memories came flooding back, days spent laughing, dreaming, and making promises that were ultimately shattered by a cruel twist of fate. Isabel felt her throat tighten, and her eyes stung with unshed tears. For a moment, she found it hard to breathe. James, noticing the sudden change in Isabel's expression, looked confused and concerned. "Is something wrong, miss?" he asked gently, his gaze filled with the sincerity of someone who had seen too much suffering. Isabel shook her head slowly, trying to find her voice. No, it's just that... This watch," she began, struggling to steady her emotions. "This watch was a gift from me to Emmanuel." Her words were barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of a long-buried truth. She continued, her eyes fixed on James, who now seemed more than just a stranger. "I loved him. I loved him deeply, James." The revelation hung heavily between them, the air charged with unspoken emotions. James's eyes widened, and a mixture of shock, pain, and a strange kind of relief crossed his weathered face. You were the woman he spoke of," James murmured, his voice trembling. "He mentioned you, but never by name. He always said he loved someone he couldn't be with. He never stopped wearing that watch, not until the day he..." James's voice broke once more, but this time he let the tears fall freely. Isabel felt a deep ache in her chest, a pain she thought she had buried years ago. She reached across the table, placing her hand over James's in a gesture of shared sorrow. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never knew he kept it all this time." James nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and understanding. "He always spoke of you with so much love, Isabel," he said quietly. "He wanted to make things right between you and his family, but life, it wasn't kind to him." Isabel's tears finally fell, soft and silent. "I've carried the pain of losing him for so long," she admitted. "But seeing you, and this watch, it's as if a part of him is still here." James, though overwhelmed by the sudden revelation, managed a small, sad smile. "I've carried the same pain," he confessed. "But today, for the first time in years, it feels like a part of that burden has lifted." The two sat in silence for a moment, their shared grief acting as both a bridge and a balm. In that quiet connection, they found a strange sense of solace, an understanding that the love they both lost still lingered, shaping their lives in unexpected ways. Isabel finally handed the watch back to James, her hand steady now. "Keep it," she said softly. "It belongs with you." James fastened the watch back onto his wrist, his eyes misty but brighter. "Thank you, Isabel," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "for everything." As they sat there, surrounded by the murmurs of the café, it was clear that this was more than just an encounter between strangers. It was the beginning of healing for both of them, two souls who had been bound by love, loss, and now an unexpected reunion. The café's hum slowly returned, but the atmosphere between Isabel and James was profoundly changed. It was as if the past, which had once been buried under layers of grief and time, was now resurfacing, demanding to be acknowledged. Isabel leaned back in her chair, her eyes still red from tears but with a new determination burning within them. "James," Isabel began gently, breaking the silence that had settled over them, "I need to know more about Emmanuel and about how he ended up alone in his last days. I thought I knew everything, but today I realize how much I was left in the dark." James sighed deeply, his eyes clouded with memories that were both precious and painful. He ran a shaky hand through his thinning hair before he spoke. "It's a long story, Isabel, and not an easy one. But you deserve to know." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Emmanuel was always a kind-hearted boy. he began, his voice carrying a mix of pride and sorrow. He had big dreams and a bigger heart. But his mother, Victoria, she had different dreams for him. She wanted him to rise in society, to marry into a wealthy family that could elevate our standing. When she found out about you, she was furious. She saw you as a threat to everything she'd hoped for. Isabel nodded, feeling a familiar sting of guilt. I remember, she admitted softly. I knew she didn't approve of me, but I never fully understood why Emmanuel felt torn between us. James's eyes grew distant as he continued. It was never about you, Isabel. It was about control. Victoria loved Emmanuel deeply, but her love was suffocating. She never accepted that he had his own path to follow, and so he was caught between pleasing her and wanting to be with you. It tore him apart. Isabel felt tears welling up again, but she held them back, determined to hear the whole story. I always wondered why he started to pull away, she confessed. One day he was making plans for us, and the next, he was gone. James's voice grew hoarser, as if the memories were physically painful. The distance wasn't by choice, he explained. Victoria kept pushing him to break things off with you, and when he resisted, she threatened to cut him off entirely. He wanted to protect you from that chaos, so he chose to distance himself. He thought it was for your own good. The revelation hit Isabel like a punch to the chest. She had always assumed that Emmanuel had left because he didn't love her enough to fight for their relationship. Now the truth, his sacrifice, felt both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. Why didn't he tell me? Isabel asked, her voice breaking. I would have understood. I would have fought with him. James's gaze softened. He was proud, Isabel. He didn't want you to see the turmoil he was going through. He thought he could handle it on his own, that he could make everything right. But things only got worse. James took a deep breath before continuing. The day Emmanuel died, it was a day like any other. Or so I thought. He was supposed to meet with you, wasn't he? Isabel nodded, her eyes now distant as well, locked on a memory she had tried so hard to suppress. Yes, she whispered. We were going to a friend's house together. It was supposed to be a day for us to escape everything, to just be us. But the accident happened, and I never got to say goodbye. James bowed his head, unable to contain his own tears. Victoria never forgave herself for that day. She blamed you, blamed me, blamed everyone but herself. And I lost my way after that. I became a shell of the man I used to be. We both did. Isabel reached out, placing her hand over James's again, feeling the frailty of his skin, but also the strength of a father's enduring love. I never wanted to be the cause of such pain, she said earnestly. I loved him more than words can say, and hearing all of this now, I wish I could have done something, anything, to change what happened. James nodded slowly, his expression filled with understanding. I know you loved him, Isabel. And he loved you too, until his last breath. The two sat in silence once more, allowing the weight of the revelations to settle between them. There was a sense of closure, albeit tinged with regret. Isabel felt a sudden urge to not only learn more about Emmanuel's past, but to see if there was still something she could do to make things right, not just for herself, but for James as well. James, she said quietly, breaking the silence, where is Victoria now? James looked up, a mixture of sadness and resignation in his eyes. She's not far from here, Isabel. She spends most of her days in a small park, just sitting on a bench, watching the world pass by. She's as lost as I was. Isabel's heart swelled with a mix of emotions, compassion, determination, and an inexplicable sense of duty. I want to see her, she said firmly. I want to try to mend what's been broken, if that's even possible. James looked at her with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Are you sure, Isabel? She's not the same woman she once was. I'm sure, Isabel replied, her voice steady. If there's a chance to bring some peace to all of this, I have to try. For Emmanuel's sake and for ours. With that, the decision was made. Isabel knew that facing Victoria would not be easy, but she felt an unexpected sense of hope. Perhaps, by confronting the past head-on, she could finally begin to heal and help James do the same. The chilly afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky as Isabel and James left the café together. The streets of the small town bustled with people going about their day, unaware of the silent journey these two were about to undertake. Isabel felt a mix of determination and nervousness settle in her chest. She was about to face a woman she had once viewed as her greatest adversary, but now she saw her as another grieving soul, bound by the same love and loss. James led the way, his steps slow and deliberate. "The park's just a few blocks away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She sits on the same bench every day. It's like she's waiting for something. Or someone." Isabel nodded but didn't reply. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this meeting was necessary. If there was any chance of reconciliation, she had to take it. The park came into view, a modest patch of greenery nestled between old buildings. A few children played nearby, their laughter a stark contrast to the stillness that seemed to emanate from a single figure sitting beneath a large oak tree. It was Victoria, once a proud, formidable woman, now hunched over on a weathered bench wrapped in a thin, tattered coat. Her once imposing posture had given way to the frailty of age, and her hair, now completely gray, was pulled back loosely, revealing a tired, lined face. As they approached, Victoria's eyes, once sharp and unyielding, glanced up with a mix of confusion and irritation. She was startled to see James with a woman by his side. "James?" she called out weakly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Who's this?" James hesitated, looking at Isabel before taking a tentative step closer to his wife. "Victoria, this is Isabel," he said softly. "She was someone very important to Emmanuel." Victoria's face immediately hardened at the mention of her son's name. Her eyes narrowed as she recognized Isabel, the woman she had long blamed for everything. "You," she said sharply, her voice rising despite its weakness. "You're the one who took him from us." Isabel felt the sting of the words but stood her ground. She took a slow, deep breath before responding, her voice steady but filled with compassion. "Yes, Victoria, I am the woman Emmanuel loved. But I never wanted to take him away from you. I loved him deeply, just as you did." Victoria's face twisted with pain, her hands clenching the worn fabric of her coat. "You don't understand," she said bitterly. "I lost everything the day he died. Everything. And I blamed you. I blamed you for taking my son away." Isabel stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I understand more than you think," she replied gently. "I lost him too, and I've carried that pain with me all these years. But I'm not here to argue about the past, Victoria. I'm here to offer a chance for peace. For both of us." Victoria's eyes, filled with anger and years of grief, began to soften. The raw emotion she had held back for so long broke through, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "How can there be peace?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you make peace with losing your child?" Isabel's own tears were not far behind. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I do know that holding on to the pain has only made it worse for both of us. Emmanuel wouldn't have wanted this, to see us like this. He loved us both, Victoria. And maybe, just maybe, we can honor that love by forgiving each other." Victoria's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking under the weight of years of suppressed sorrow. James stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, his own eyes wet with tears. "It's time to let go, dear," he whispered gently. "We've held on to this pain for too long." Isabel reached out, her hand trembling but sincere, offering it to Victoria. "I know this won't be easy," she said softly. "But maybe, just for today, we can start by sitting together. Just sitting, and talking if you'd like. We don't have to be enemies anymore." For a long, tense moment, Victoria simply stared at Isabel's outstretched hand. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she reached out and took it. Her grip was weak but filled with a quiet acceptance. "Maybe. she whispered, her voice breaking. Maybe we can try. Isabel and James both nodded, tears streaming down their faces. It wasn't complete forgiveness, nor was it full closure, but it was a start, a small step toward healing. And in that moment, beneath the sheltering oak tree, it felt like the first light of hope in a very long time. The days that followed were filled with a cautious sense of renewal. The unexpected meeting in the park had cracked open a door that had long been sealed, allowing a sliver of light to enter the lives of Isabel, James, and Victoria. Though the past could not be changed, it seemed that the three of them were now open to the idea of moving forward, together. Isabel had invited James and Victoria to stay with her temporarily, offering them a warm bed and hot meals in her comfortable home. At first, Victoria had resisted, too proud and too wary to accept such generosity from the woman she had once despised. But James, his eyes filled with quiet determination, had convinced her otherwise. "We need this, Victoria," he had said simply, "not just for survival, but for our hearts." And so, with great reluctance, Victoria had accepted. Isabel's home was modest but elegant, filled with reminders of her successful life, a life built on resilience and hard work after Emmanuel's death. As James and Victoria stepped through the door, they were struck by the warmth of the space. It was clear that it was not just a house, but a place where love had once flourished. Over the following days, small but meaningful moments began to unfold. Victoria, who had been closed off and bitter, found herself drawn to the little comforts that had long been absent from her life: a soft pillow, a warm cup of tea, the sound of laughter echoing through the house. She often sat by the window, staring out at the world beyond, as if trying to process this new reality. Isabel remained patient, never pushing Victoria to talk about the past. Instead, she focused on making the present a little brighter each day. One morning, she found Victoria in the kitchen, struggling to make coffee. Isabel approached her quietly, then gently took over, her movements calm and sure. "You don't have to do this for us," Victoria said, her voice surprisingly soft. "We're not charity cases." Isabel smiled gently as she handed Victoria a steaming mug. "It's not charity, Victoria. It's just kindness. I'm not doing this out of pity. I'm doing it because I want to. And because, deep down, I know Emmanuel would have wanted it too." Victoria's eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening around the mug. "I suppose he would have," she admitted quietly. It was the closest she had come to acknowledging the bond they all shared. In the evenings, the three would sit together in the living room, sharing stories about Emmanuel. James often spoke about Emmanuel's childhood, his adventurous spirit, and his dreams of a better world. Victoria added her own memories, once laced with bitterness but now softened by a strange mix of longing and acceptance. Isabel listened quietly, contributing her own stories about the love she and Emmanuel had shared, the plans they had made, the laughter they had shared, and the dreams that had never come to be. One evening, as the three of them sat by the fire, Victoria broke the silence with a surprising statement. "I never thought I'd be here," she said, her voice raw but honest. "I never thought I could sit in the same room as you, Isabel, let alone feel grateful." Isabel turned to Victoria, her eyes filled with warmth and sincerity. "I never thought we'd be here either," she admitted, "but I'm grateful too. We can't change what happened, but we can choose how we move forward." Victoria nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to fully forgive everything," she confessed. "But I can try, and that's more than I ever thought possible." Isabel reached out, gently placing a hand over Victoria's. "That's all we need, Victoria," she said softly. "Just a start, for Emmanuel's sake, and for ours." The quiet understanding between them felt like a fragile but hopeful step toward true healing. There was no magic moment of complete reconciliation, no sudden erasure of the pain they had endured. But there was a sense of progress, a feeling that they were no longer stuck in the past but moving slowly and carefully toward a better future. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of hope grew stronger. James, now more relaxed than Isabel had ever seen him, even managed to laugh occasionally, his eyes twinkling with a hint of the man he had once been. Victoria, though still reserved, began to smile more often, her face softening with each passing day. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a promising new beginning. Forgiveness, they realized, was not a single act, but a journey they were now willing to take together. And in that shared decision there was a sense of peace they had never thought possible. As the weeks passed, the tentative bond between Isabel, James, and Victoria began to solidify into something more enduring. Isabel's home, which had once felt filled with only memories of what might have been, was now alive with the presence of two people who were also learning to heal. Yet Isabel knew that this was just a temporary stop for James and Victoria, a place to recover, not to stay forever. They needed a home of their own, a space where they could rebuild their lives on their own terms. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Isabel broached the subject. "James, Victoria," she began carefully, "I've been thinking, you both deserve a place that feels truly yours, a place where you can start fresh, but with the comfort and stability you haven't had in a long time." James and Victoria exchanged a glance, surprise and uncertainty evident in their eyes. "Isabel," James said slowly, "you've already done so much for us. We couldn't possibly ask for more." Isabel shook her head, her expression earnest. "You're not asking, James. I'm offering. I've found a small house not too far from here, and I think it could be perfect for you. It's simple but cozy, and there's even a garden where you could grow flowers or vegetables if you'd like." Victoria, who had been quietly listening, felt a lump form in her throat. The idea of having a place of their own seemed almost too good to be true, too far removed from the streets and shelters that had defined her reality for so long. "But how could we afford it?" she asked hesitantly. Isabel's eyes were filled with kindness. "Consider it a gift, Victoria. You both deserve a second chance, and I want to help make that happen. It's not charity. It's a step toward a new beginning for all of us." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, and she quickly looked away, overwhelmed by the generosity she had never imagined receiving from Isabel. James reached over and gently squeezed her hand, his own eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Isabel," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never thought we'd have another home." In the days that followed, Isabel threw herself into finding the right place and preparing it for James and Victoria. The small house she had mentioned was located in a quiet neighborhood, not too far from the park where they had first reconnected. It was a modest single-story home with white walls and blue shutters, a small porch, and a neat little yard in the back. Isabel worked tirelessly to make it feel welcoming. She added simple but comfortable furniture, fresh linens, and small touches like colorful curtains and cheerful flowers on the windowsills. She even found a set of gardening tools and left them on the porch along with packets of seeds, sunflowers, tomatoes, and daisies. The day of the move arrived, bringing a mix of excitement and nervousness. Isabel, James, and Victoria stood outside the small house, taking in the sight of what would be the start of a new chapter. Victoria seemed hesitant, her hand lingering on the doorknob as if afraid to enter. "Go ahead," Isabel encouraged gently. "This is your home now." With a deep breath, Victoria pushed open the door and stepped inside, followed closely by James. They moved slowly through the rooms, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. The living room was bright and cozy, with a soft rug underfoot and framed photographs of nature lining the walls. The kitchen was small but functional, its counters spotless and ready for the first home-cooked meal they would share in years. Victoria paused in the doorway of what would be their bedroom, her hand lightly brushing the clean sheets that Isabel had neatly laid on the bed. She turned to Isabel, her voice choked with emotion. It's perfect," she managed to say, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd have a place to call home again." Isabel stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Victoria's shoulder. "You do now, Victoria, you both do. This is a new beginning, and you deserve every moment of it." James, standing in the middle of the living room, suddenly laughed, a sound that was warm and filled with hope. "I never thought I'd be planting sunflowers again," he said with a grin, noticing the packets of seeds on the porch through the open window. "I haven't done that since Emmanuel was a boy." The mention of Emmanuel brought a brief silence, but it was not a painful one. Instead, it felt like a reminder of the love that had connected all three of them. Isabel nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Then it's time to start again, James. Emmanuel's memory will always be a part of this home, just as he's always been a part of our hearts." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the three of them gathered around the small kitchen table for their first meal in the new house. It was a simple dinner: soup, bread, and a salad made with fresh vegetables, but it felt like a feast. They laughed, shared stories, and even talked about the future with a hope that hadn't been present before. After dinner, they stepped outside to the small backyard. James, with newfound energy, picked up a trowel and began digging a small hole in the soft soil. Victoria joined him, her movements slow but deliberate as she gently placed a seed into the ground. Isabel watched them with a deep sense of fulfillment. The sight of James and Victoria planting sunflowers together, their faces softened by the glow of the setting sun, was more than she had hoped for. It was a symbol of renewal, a sign that life, though marked by loss, could still bloom anew. James stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "It's been a long time since I've felt this kind of peace," he said quietly. "I think Emmanuel would be happy, don't you?" Isabel nodded, her eyes misty but full of warmth. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he'd be very happy." Victoria, looking up at the sky, whispered a silent prayer, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Thank you," she said, not just to Isabel but to life itself for giving her a second chance. In that moment, surrounded by the simple beauty of their new home, they each felt a sense of closure and a promise of brighter days ahead. The past would always be a part of them, but the future was now theirs to create, a future built on forgiveness, hope, and the enduring power of love. The days in James and Victoria's new home settled into a gentle rhythm. Isabel continued to visit often, ensuring they had everything they needed and that the house truly felt like a home. James was already tending to the garden, with the first sunflower sprouts breaking through the soil. Victoria, while still reserved, seemed lighter. There were even moments of quiet laughter between the three, a small but meaningful sign of healing. One sunny afternoon, Isabel arrived with a warm smile, carrying a basket filled with fresh bread, cheese, and fruits. "I thought we could have lunch together," she announced, setting the basket on the kitchen table. James and Victoria, pleasantly surprised, welcomed her warmly. As they began to set the table, Isabel hesitated, a curious excitement flashing in her eyes. "Actually," she said, her voice unusually vibrant, "I brought someone along with me today." Before James or Victoria could ask who, the front door creaked open. In walked a tall young man with dark hair and a wide, friendly smile. He was well dressed, but with a relaxed, approachable manner. His eyes were bright and full of warmth, and he carried himself with a confidence that was at once familiar and comforting. "Mom!" the young man called, his voice filled with enthusiasm. Isabel's face lit up with joy. "Come here, Ethan," she responded, waving him over. James and Victoria watched in stunned silence as Ethan stepped into the room, his smile broadening as he approached the table. "James, Victoria," Isabel began, her voice filled with pride. "This is my son, Ethan." The revelation hung in the air for a moment, a surprise so profound that neither James nor Victoria seemed to know how to react. Isabel's son, the boy she had raised alone after Emmanuel's death, stood before them, a tangible symbol of the future they had never thought to imagine. Ethan extended his hand to James, his grip firm but gentle. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you both," he said warmly. "I've heard so much about you from my mom." James, his eyes wide with wonder, shook Ethan's hand with a mixture of awe and emotion. It's a pleasure to meet you too," he stammered. "You look so much like your mother." Victoria, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly felt tears well up in her eyes. Ethan, noticing her emotion, approached her with gentle sincerity. "I've heard about how strong you've both been," he said softly, "and I just want you to know how grateful I am for everything you meant to my mother and to my father." At the mention of Emmanuel, Victoria's tears fell freely, but this time they were not tears of bitterness or regret. They were tears of release, of seeing Emmanuel's legacy alive in this young man who stood before her, full of kindness and promise. She reached out, pulling Ethan into a tentative hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for being here." The moment was both tender and transformative, a meeting that felt like a completion of a circle that had begun long ago. Isabel watched with glistening eyes, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and relief. Ethan was the living bridge between the past and the present, and his presence seemed to fill the room with hope. As they all sat down for lunch, the conversation flowed easily. Ethan, with his youthful energy and genuine interest, quickly warmed up to James and Victoria. He asked about their life stories, listened intently to tales of Emmanuel's childhood, and shared amusing anecdotes from his time at university. "You know," Ethan said with a smile, "Mom always told me that my father was a dreamer. I see that same spark in both of you." James nodded, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "He was a dreamer, all right," he agreed. "And I think you carry that same spirit, Ethan." Victoria, her voice softer but filled with warmth, added, "You remind me of him, so full of life, so full of kindness." Ethan's face lit up, touched by their words. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "It means more than you know." As the afternoon wore on, the sense of family deepened. For the first time in years, there was a feeling of genuine belonging. The old wounds had not disappeared, but they were now accompanied by new bonds, ones built on shared stories, laughter, and the simple joy of being together. As they finished their meal, Isabel looked around the table, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "This is what Emmanuel would have wanted," she said softly. "All of us here, together." And for the first time, Victoria smiled without reservation. "Yes," she agreed. "He would have wanted this." The warm glow of the setting sun filled the small living room as Isabel, James, Victoria, and Ethan sat together, their conversation filled with both laughter and thoughtful silences. The last few months had transformed them all, turning a tragic past into a foundation for hope. There was a feeling of peace that settled over the house, a peace that had once seemed unattainable. Victoria, once haunted by grief and bitterness, had found a quiet strength within herself. She was still cautious, but the anger that had defined her for so long had started to fade. She often sat on the front porch with Isabel, sharing simple stories about her past, stories she had kept hidden beneath layers of sorrow. For the first time, she felt understood, even forgiven. James, with his garden in full bloom, seemed rejuvenated by the act of nurturing new life. He spent hours tending to the flowers he had planted, sunflowers, daisies, and marigolds, each bloom a symbol of the healing he had undergone. One afternoon, as he stood proudly amidst the garden, he turned to Ethan and said, "I never thought I'd be planting these again. Not like this. Emmanuel would have loved to see it." Ethan smiled, placing a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "He would have been proud of you, James, and of Victoria. You both kept his spirit alive, even when it seemed impossible." Isabel, watching this exchange from the porch, felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. Her journey had started with love and loss, but now it was filled with the promise of a future that held new meaning. The young woman who had once felt abandoned and broken now saw herself as a part of something larger, a family that had been rebuilt from the ruins. Later that evening, Isabel gathered everyone around the kitchen table for a small celebration. She had cooked a simple but hearty dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh green beans from James's garden. The air was filled with warmth, not just from the meal but from the shared joy of being together. Victoria looked around the table, her eyes bright with an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "I never imagined we'd be here," she said quietly. "I never thought I could sit at a table like this and feel whole again." Isabel reached across the table, taking Victoria's hand. "Neither did I," she admitted, her voice soft. "But we made it together." James raised his glass of lemonade, his eyes filled with gratitude. "To Emmanuel," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And to the family we've found again." Ethan, his eyes bright, raised his glass as well. "To new beginnings," he added, his tone sincere, "and to honoring the love that brought us here." They all clinked their glasses, a gesture that seemed to seal not just the moment, but a commitment to the future, a commitment to continue healing, loving, and living fully. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer wounds that defined them. They were reminders of resilience, of forgiveness that had grown stronger than the pain that had once divided them. After dinner, they moved to the porch where the stars had begun to twinkle in the clear night sky. The gentle hum of crickets filled the air, a soundtrack to their newfound peace. James sat back in his chair, looking up at the sky. "Do you think Emmanuel is watching us?" he asked quietly. Victoria, sitting beside him, smiled gently. "I believe he is," she said, "and I think he's happy." Ethan nodded, looking up at the stars with a thoughtful expression. "He's always with us," he said, his voice calm, "in everything we do and every step we take forward." Isabel, feeling a swell of emotion, whispered, "He brought us together, and he gave us the chance to start again." The four of them sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts but united by the bond they had formed. It wasn't just the physical home that had been rebuilt, it was the sense of family that had been restored. In the quiet of the night, there was an undeniable feeling of hope, not just for tomorrow, but for all the days ahead. As the evening wore on, they slowly retreated indoors, leaving the porch empty except for the stars and the gentle breeze. But even as they left the space, the warmth remained, a testament to a love that had transcended time, grief, and even death itself. For the first time in years, they were no longer haunted by what had been lost. Instead, they were anchored by what they had found: each other. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the wounds of the past, love and forgiveness have the power to heal. Sometimes life brings us full circle, offering unexpected chances for redemption and new beginnings. And while we can't change what has already happened, we can choose how we move forward, together, stronger and filled with hope. Let this be a reminder that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to reach out, to mend, and to create new memories. If you believe in the power of love, forgiveness, and second chances, be part of our journey. Hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Join us as we share more heartfelt stories that inspire hope and spread kindness. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one story to make a difference.